Well, I think you should also add that even at that time, public opinion did not believe the United States. People knew the truth, and that's why millions of people were rallying in London and throughout the world, really. People were completely opposed to the war. No one believed the evidence. They knew that the United States and the UK were fabricating this information. Before I begin a brief discussion about the case itself, I just want to point out that I agree with what your previous guests, a couple of them, said about the United States really having serious trouble at home and abroad, and it's basically trying to distract attention away from its own problems. But let's look at the story itself. First of all, this Iranian allegedly speaks to a hitman in Mexico and tells him that I have a cousin who's a general, an important general in Iran. Why in the world would a person who wishes to carry out such an attack give such information to a hitman, to a mercenary? That is utterly implausible to believe. On the other hand, later on when he speaks, or when he's in custody, he allegedly again speaks to his cousin, who is this general and a commander, on the phone, and his general tells him to carry, out the alleged assassination. Would a general, would a senior commanding officer say such a thing on a phone, on an international line, to the United States? It's again completely implausible. Third, the fact that money was sent, it was wired, $100,000 if I'm not mistaken. Over $10,000 would go under clear scrutiny of the United States, and any money by an Iranian to Mexico or to Mexicans would definitely be traceable. So these make the story almost completely implausible. And as one of your guests also said, the drug lords in Mexico, they have their own world, and they make billions of dollars, and they would not attempt to kill a person for $1.5 million and mess up their billions of dollars of profits, because that would create an enormous response from the United States. And if the Iranians were actually after such an operation, which is again impossible to believe, they would know about this sort of thing. We have our own drug lords in Afghanistan, thanks to the United States. Drug production in Afghanistan has increased 30-fold over the last decade. So the Iranians know very well how drug lords work. So the story is completely implausible. It's more like a joke. But if you look at the Western media, they automatically believe the story, and they're now talking about why the Iranians have carried out this attack. They don't ask questions, and I think that shows the independence of the Western media.
Well, the problem that comes about here, Christopher Walker, please tell us how it is that you have a country like the United States, and they have been blamed for making false accusations before on Iran, can come about, present this in court, and provide their own version in terms of the allegations, and then the U.S. Defense Secretary of State Hillary Clinton trying to rally support behind making moves towards Iran, which may result, if it hasn't already, on sanctions. Now, isn't that illogical? And more importantly, is that legal?
I don't think it's particularly legal, but I mean, that doesn't often worry the government of the United States, as some of the prison tactics in Guantanamo Bay have shown us. But I think what doesn't surprise me is that they're all in this together. It's obviously got some sort of purpose. It must perhaps be a blend, as we said earlier. Take the US attention off the domestic economic mess. Let's focus that searchlight back to some familiar territory that we don't like. Then we've got, there's Iran. Let's stir something up on them, and at the same time provoke. I mean, because this can't have gone down terribly well in Riyadh with the Saudi rulers. So this is, I see a bit of mischief here in sort of getting the cage rattled in the Middle East at the time of the Arab Spring, and making sure that Iran, if possible, Iran and Saudi Arabia don't make any overtures towards each other and leave America in the middle as the sort of the big ruling bear. But it's symptomatic, really, all in all. And I think that the fact that all your contributors have agreed on this, it's a sort of, it's a joke. No intelligence agency in the world, and certainly not one that's not one like the Iranian that's got a good, if somewhat shady reputation, would act. Can you imagine? I mean, this would have James Bond laughing all the way to the bank.
Well, James Fetzer, is really the United States so desperate to turn attention away from its domestic policies regarding these protest movements that they had to go to this extreme? Tell us whether it is the case, if we put it in that context, or is it that, I think Christopher Walker alluded there, that perhaps there's a connection with Saudi Arabia placing pressure on the U.S. Since relations obviously are not at its best with Iran?
I think this case illustrates the maxim that in Washington, the bigger the liar, the further you go. Eric Holder has been on the hot seat for this fast and furious business. This is another attempt to make him look good, to salvage his reputation, just as the use of troops in Pakistan in the feigned attack on the compound to kill a man who died in December 15, 2001, was staged to elevate Obama's poll standings, reduce attention to its birth certificate issue, and justify having those troops there, where we're using Predator drones to kill 140 innocent civilians for every target. It's embarrassing to say, but listening to Colin Powell, I'm reminded not only did we find no weapons of mass destruction, but even George Bush himself would eventually admit Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. Independent investigations by the Pentagon and the Senate established that Iraq had not been in collusion with al-Qaeda. And even our own FBI would eventually admit that they had no hard evidence that tied Osama bin Laden to 9/11. I'm sorry to say that this kind of fakery and pseudo investigation is disgracing the United States. And if Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and Barack Obama are standing behind it, then they are going to be candidates to replace the three stooges.
Philip Giraldi, ultimately, let's look at this. As far as the U.S. using this as a pretext to eventually attack Iran, let's look at some of the posturing. First, the Pentagon, after the news broke out, came out in the past few hours and said, well, this needs a diplomatic, not a military response. And then on the other hand, you had the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton talk about Iran needs to be more isolated. But in particular, chances of U.S. attacking Iran, what do you think?
I think they're very low if the United States is the one making the decision. But if Israel were to stage an attack, then I think it's inevitable the United States would get drawn in. But I think there's something everybody's missing here. Leon Panetta was in Israel last week, and I think it's generally accepted that Panetta warned the Israelis that the Obama administration does not want Israel to unilaterally attack Iran. And every time the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense goes to Israel and gives them a warning about something, you usually see within a few days something happening to basically tell the Israelis, but we're still on your side. I rather suspect the timing of this whole thing is going back to the Israelis to make a case to put more pressure on Iran. And I think that's the quid pro quo that we're seeing here. Don't attack Iran, but we're going to put more pressure on them, and we have this story in the pipeline that will enable us to do that. So I'm just speculating on that. I have no specific information on it, but I think it's something worth thinking about because you see this pattern repeated over and over again. And certainly the Israelis, of all the players in this thing that we're talking about, are the only ones that really have a strong desire to go to war with Iran. I don't think anyone else, even the United States, has any serious desire in that direction. So I think this is something we should be thinking about.
Okay, unfortunately, so much more to discuss, but we've ran out of time. Thank you very much. That's Philip Giraldi, former CIA officer, with the statements. Thank you so much from Washington. Also, I'd like to thank Professor of University of Tehran, Mohammad Marandi, who joined us from Beirut, Middle East expert Christopher Walker. Thank you. He gave us the statements from London, an American philosopher and professor emeritus at the University of Minnesota, Duluth, James H. Fetzer from Madison. And of course, you from watching, don't forget to send us any questions or emails. Newsroom@presstv.r is our address. From me, and the entire team, it's goodbye.